follows an extract from my book Fête Fatale, available from Amazon. Chapter 5, Part 1. Police Sergeant Robert Maddox was good at his job. As a village policeman, he had unending patience to sit with a cup of tea, listening to the petty grievances of lonely old women. He could break up a local pub brawl whilst exuding friendliness to all parties, and would probably end up with a complimentary pint as he sat chatting with the combatants at the end of the evening. He was more than happy to give up an hour of his time for Jean on this evening of the fête. He wouldn't rush the conversation and would drink as many cups of tea as were necessary to put the lady at her ease, so that he could gather the information that he needed by gleaning it from the tide of irrelevant chatter. His only concern was that Jean wasn't the gossipy type and would merely answer his questions formally, which was likely to result in incomplete information. He knew that if she offered to put the kettle on, things were likely to go well. The ringing doorbell was answered by Betty, who seemed thrilled to see him. "Hello, Bobby, how nice to see you." "Hello, Mrs. Barnesford. I didn't expect to see you here. I'm glad that you're looking after Mrs. Barlow." "You'd better come on in. Jean's been expecting you since she's got in. We've made sure that she's had a rest and a bite to eat, but she won't settle until she's seen you. I suppose that she just wants to get all this unpleasant business out of the way." Maddox was led through a grand hallway which was sparsely furnished, except for a large abstract painting on the wall next to the staircase, into the vast kitchen. At a low marble-topped breakfast bar sat Jean and Eileen. Eileen was fussing over a teapot and a plate of scones, while Jean sat staring vacantly at the TV, which was recessed into the small grey slate wall tiles. Looking around, he could see that the room was aggressively immaculate. The stainless steel double oven looked as if it had never cooked a meal. He simply couldn't imagine roast beef residing in the oven and besmirching the pristine glass or the gleaming shelves. Nor could he picture a saucepan of gravy spitting its contents up the metal backplate, which gleamed and twinkled reflections from the angled LED ceiling lights. Henrietta must have her work cut out for her, continually polishing all of those glossy surfaces. His attention was drawn away from thoughts of Henrietta by Eileen, who was pouring him a cup of tea and talking to him. "I imagine that you'll want to talk quietly together, so we'll get out of your way. Be sure to call me, Jean, if you want anything at all. I'm only a few minutes away at any time of the day or night, so promise to ring if you're not feeling up to managing yet," said Eileen. Jean drew her eyes, if not her attention, away from the TV and nodded to Eileen and Betty as they were leaving. Although Maddox was now holding the prerequisite cup of tea, it had not been offered by Jean herself, and he was unsure of his welcome. He had a feeling that this was going to be uphill work. Taking a deep breath, he made a start. "Shall we go and sit somewhere where we can be a bit more comfortable?" he asked. He was silently led into a cream-carpeted lounge and was directed to sit on a pale oatmeal-coloured armchair. The only vibrant splashes of colour were the Royal Doulton flambe ornaments positioned at intervals about the room. He now heartily wished that he wasn't carrying the unadvisably hoped-for tea, and fully intended to empty his cup down his throat as quickly as possible before he spilled anything on the immaculate carpet or furnishings. He secretly wondered if anybody ever sat or relaxed in this room, or was it reserved for visitors. At least it was away from the active TV, and he should be able to hold her attention better in here. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Barlow. I know that you must have an awful lot on your mind. If you could just spare me a little time to gather a few details, you can imagine the paperwork I've got to deal with, I'm sure." Jean smiled at his light-hearted manner, but she was distant and it didn't seem like he was getting through. Nevertheless, he ploughed on. "I understand that John had been diagnosed with diabetes not too long ago, and that he had been unwell recently. I've spoken with Dr. Wainwright, but, if I'm not mistaken, I don't expect he went to see him very often." Jean gave a distant smile and agreed that this was the case. I'm hoping that you can give me some more detailed information so that we can find an explanation for what may have caused John's death. Dr. Wainwright wasn't of the opinion that John's medical condition was serious, and so we're wondering what other factors might have exacerbated his symptoms. Can you tell me about some of the things that have been worrying John? John was very careful about his diet, more than anybody I knew. I used to complain about his fussiness, and I said he was like a hypochondriac. I didn't think it matters as much as he made out. Just this week I gave him some of his favourite jam. I didn't think it'd matter, and now he's dead. Dr. Wainwright is convinced that such a small deviation in diet couldn't have proved fatal. You mustn't even consider such a thing. I can't blame John for eating a little bit at breakfast. It won first prize at the fête, I gather. It won joint first prize. It's just like Darcy to not make up her mind. Not that it matters now. Jean shook her head sorrowfully, but no tears followed, and Maddox thought it safe to continue. Can you give me any idea of what was troubling John? I know that he'd had some worries. Can you give me some details of what they might have been? I understand that he'd recently had to come out of retirement to deal with certain business matters. Is that right? Yes, it was so tiresome his being shut up in the office so much. I never really paid much attention to his business. He tried telling me, but I didn't understand what he was saying, so I'm afraid that I wasn't really listening. He was on the telephone to Greece quite a lot recently, I know. One time I was trying to call Kirsty to ask her if I could have some rose petals, as I hadn't enough that weren't going brown at the edges. Every time I picked up the receiver, he was still on the line. They were speaking English, so I could tell what they were saying, but I hung up each time until the line was free. Have you any idea of what was going on, even if it's just the smallest guess? Something which could explain the sudden collapse in John's health. I know that he's had problems with some property he owns over there. I think I heard something about tax, but more than that I really can't say. I'm sorry, I left all that sort of thing to John. It's getting late now, and I'm sure that you've had more than enough for one day. Would you mind if I came back again tomorrow and had a look through the paperwork in his office before I write up my report? Jean nodded her consent, but her attention was dwindling. Is there anybody you'd like me to contact for you? Do you want some company tonight? Jean shook her head and said that she'd like to be quietly on her own. I don't think I could stand another cup of tea. I'd just like a hot bath and then get into bed. I'm so tired. I can telephone Eileen later if I change my mind. Don't you worry about me. Walking to the door, Maddox said, If you're sure, once again, I am very sorry. If you need me or think of anything you want to talk about before tomorrow, just ring me at home. You know my mum doesn't mind. Jean smiled and thanked him, and then closed the door the instant he stepped outside. Thinking that the interview had been less than successful, Maddox walked the few streets home. He entered his mother's kitchen through the back door with a renewed sense of gratitude. Although their house was positively lowly in comparison with the house he'd just been to, the sense of homeliness was tangible. The smell of cottage pie he'd eaten before he'd left to visit Jean still hung in the atmosphere, and the bits and bobs of clutter gave the place an everyday welcome. You just knew that anybody could pop in for a chat and be at ease. Towering over his diminutive mother, he gave her a close impression of a bear hug before he walked into the living room to pull off his boots. Mrs. Maddox beamed at the unexpected gesture, but was wise enough not to question it. "How did you get along? Not a nice job for you tonight, huh?" she said. Kicking his boots to one side, Robert stretched his long legs out towards the empty hearth in an accustomed gesture, even if it wasn't lit on this warm evening. "I didn't get along at all, that's how. Jean couldn't tell me much and she wasn't in the mood for talking. I'll have to go back and try again tomorrow. Hopefully she'll have had chance to gather herself a bit by then. I don't like pestering her, but it's got to be done." Poor Jean, sitting there all alone. What kind of finish John so unexpectedly, do you think? I don't suppose any of us can expect a written warning though, can we? Not that I'd want one, thank you. I think John's way was the best, no warning at all. 1 minute you're here, 1 minute you're not. It's for the best, I say. You're probably right, but I can't put that on my paperwork, and neither can Dr. Wainwright. He can't positively say he expected it, and so I'll have to rummage through John's business dealings while Wainwright rummages through his medical notes and hope we can come up with some reasonable explanation between us. I'm going back to Jean's tomorrow, and then I'm having a meeting with Wainwright. Hopefully we can wrap it all up. If not, we'll have to suggest he topped himself. Shame on you. Don't let me hear you spouting such nonsense again. It's very unprofessional for a start, not to mention unkind. Now have your supper and get yourself off to bed. Then you can get up and start tomorrow like a sensible human being. Robert stood up and kissed his mother on the top of her head, and for once he was happy to do as he was told. He plodded up the stairs, taking his buttered toast with him, wondering if Wainwright had come up with any inspiration, or if he would find some himself tomorrow morning in John's office. For the full book of Fête Fatale, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.